Let's start by saying yes, in the sense that during the construction of the wall and thereafter, starting in the early 2000s, there was a decrease of such terrorist attacks. But we immediately need to add a but. And that is sort of a twofold but. The first one is that the real reason for that decrease wasn't really the construction of the wall. It was other political and military activities, to which I will sort of return later on in response to another question. And the second one is that there's a little sort of, chronological gap here between the construction itself, or an incongruity rather than a gap, between the construction of the wall itself and that decrease. The decrease didn't follow the construction. It happened actually during it and even before. So the cause-effect relationship doesn't quite work that way. I think one actually can make a very good case that the wall is simply one tool in a larger toolbox of Israeli policies that are meant to perpetuate and indeed deepen a control of the West Bank and in some ways, although other ways earlier on of Gaza, not that the wall exactly of the same fashion was built there, but there was a sort of a very serious sort of, obstacle, a very seriously policed and militarized fence as well. What are these other tools in that toolbox? They are, for instance, keeping Palestinians from their land for a very protracted period of time, which creates the illusion that actually nobody is using that land, which makes it easier in turn, politically speaking, for Israeli settlers to illegally occupy that land. It is creating administrative hurdles of all sorts to do with identity papers and other sort of documents that make it difficult for Palestinians to basically have and follow an everyday routine. And also, of course, earlier to the construction of the wall and also thereafter, the sort of periodical setup of all sorts of different roadblocks within the Palestinian territories, within the West Bank itself. There are other policies too. One should maybe note that those are all historically rooted in the really earliest years of the post-1967 occupation of the West Bank itself. This didn't come about just in the 1990s or even during the construction of the wall. Rather, they predate that construction by multiple decades and are in turn based, at least partly, on policies that were tried out in Israel proper between 1948 and 1967 vis-à-vis the Arab population, which that is something most people perhaps don't know. Most of that Arab population lived actually under military government within Israel proper until 67, from 48 to 66 roughly. And sort of the tools developed at that point in time then were fed into the tools that were developed from 67 onwards in order to divide, control, really know in all the best details the Palestinian society, which is basically run by the Israeli internal security services. If I may give a little sort of a film reference, a very interesting film documentary film was released, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, something like that. In Hebrew it's called Shomrei Asaf. I think in English it's The Gatekeepers. And it's a series of interviews, I think all in all 6 hours long. There's a shortened version as well, with ex-heads of the Shabak, of the Israeli security services. And they talk about these things, obviously, too. Two things I'd say. First, it is indeed true that not exactly that sort of wall, but other types of fences, walls, barricades were used in earlier decades. In mandatory Palestine, for instance, during the 36 to 39 Arab revolt, also sometimes called the Palestine Revolt, which mainly targeted the British imperial sort of administration, but partly and more secondarily also targeted people in the Yishuv, as well as Arabs who were seen as collaborators by other Palestinians. During that revolt, starting in 37 or 38, all the way to 39, the British built a fence system on the border to Lebanon. Why? Because a substantial number, we don't quite know how many, but the substantial number of Lebanese, as well as Syrians, Transjordanians and other Arabs, actually would cross from Lebanon as well as from other sort of neighboring countries into Palestine in order to assist the revolt. And that fence wall, Taggart Wall, named after the police officer who had actually helped build it, who, if I'm not mistaken, before served in India and used policing techniques developed in India, in Palestine itself. That sort of wall had a great effect on the everyday life of locals, obviously because they couldn't get to their fields, etc., etc. So we have that example. We have a number of other examples, fences between Syria and Turkey that were built sort of intermittently. What all these examples, what their role is today is, I think, difficult to say. I mean, one could talk about their memory. One could talk about their effect now. I think this is a very, very big sort of field. And I don't think we can generalize, because it also really matters where you live. I think somebody living in Syria itself, in its north, probably has a very different memory and a very different practical approach to this issue than, let's say, somebody who is now 80 or 90 years old and lives in northern Israel and south Lebanon and has lived with, walls of that sort for the past decades, many, many decades.